Hey everyone, and welcome to Ideas xLab's Uncovering Connection and Inclusion video podcast. I'm Josh Miller, the co-founder and CEO of Ideas xLab, and over the past few months, we have been engaging leaders from across sectors and from Louisville and our nation in dynamic conversations around uncovering inclusion and how we adapt and evolve our plans and work as strategically and as collaboratively as possible to create change as we all move forward. So today I'm really excited to be joined by Brydie Harris and Xian Brooks for today's conversation. This is going to be the last for this first season of our Uncovering Video podcast, and I can't wait to dive in and to hear from them and keep this conversation going. So give me just 1 second and I'm going to get them up on the screen. Hey friends, how are you all?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, thank you for having us.
I am so glad that you all were able to join me today. This has been a really great conversation series to have, and you all are the first couple that we've had on as guests together, so I'm really looking forward to having that added layer as we dive into our conversation today.
Oh, good, neat.
So I'd really love to start with you all. If you could each take a minute to introduce yourselves one by one, and you can share your name, preferred pronouns, your organizational affiliation, and also what gives you oxygen in your life and work.
We could introduce each other as a test of our true loyalty. My name is Heather Brydie Harris. I go by Brydie. My pronouns are they, them. Let's see, I'm introducing myself and what gives me oxygen. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Louisville in Pan-African Studies. Let's see, an animal enthusiast, a gardener, a scholar activist, and I think it's all of those things that give me oxygen, helping to create life, nurturing people and creativity and plants and animals and one another. Those things are ever more sacred to me right now, I think, as oxygen sometimes feels incredibly thin, as I just remind myself to breathe at this very second. So doing things that are life-giving right now is what gives me oxygen.
So my name is Xian Brooks. It's funny, as I introduce myself, I just think about just like the contrast between me and Brydie and how like those differences like pair us up nicely. So I'm a public health professional. I work at the University of Louisville Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the Health Science Campus. I'm a gun enthusiast. I am a trained doula working towards certification. I train MMA. I have a giant Great Pyrenees puppy that takes up a lot of time. And I think that like the things that give me oxygen are I think like going out and shooting and just being a Black person that exercises my Second Amendment rights. Hanging out with my dog. He is a huge source of support for me. And the MMA fighting training, that definitely gets out a lot of the, I think like anger and frustration in like a constructive way. So I'm getting, to exercise and be healthy and, have like this healthy release.
One of the things, thank you all for sharing that. And one of the things that I've loved about getting to know you all is there are so many different ways that you all, whether it's kind of self-care or those, the practices like MMA or the gardening, like there's so many different facets for how you all are exploring and thinking about what it means to be a member of the Black community, the LGBTQ plus community, the community here in Louisville. And I know, Xian, one of the things you were working on the last time I saw you was embroidery as well. And so kind of how you all weave in those creative facets is something that I really love.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the one thing that's true for both of us, and well, let me take it back 1 second. A thought activity we often do together is like, what would we be if we weren't constantly, in the battle fighting for Black liberation? Or, like if white supremacy, transphobia, homophobia disappeared, like, would we be in the roles and jobs that we're in? Would we be involved in the things we were in? I would probably be a horticulturist or something instead of a Black Studies scholar. Maybe not.
I'd be a musical anthropologist.
Right. We already have our jobs picked out. What we would be if we weren't constantly, feeling and wanting to feel this way. Our duty to be fighting for Black liberation, and in every facet. If it's food, it's like, okay, who can we feed? If it's embroidering, it's like, how can we bring radical softness to the image of and practice of Black men's lives? If it's being a doula, it's like, how can I show up for those who are being hurt by the system and be another Black queer person in that room? So it's like this constant striving of either bringing forth life or protecting the life that we have here already.
Brydie, I think you really just spoke to a lot of what my next question was, but as you all either individually or collectively as a couple, because there's facets that you all kind of have your own domain expertise in areas where you all work together. What is the vision for the future that you all have and are working towards, and some of the underlying values that's really guiding that work?
Yeah, I don't know. So I guess when I think about the future and the values, I've actually had to answer a question like this a few times this month. But when I was in undergrad, I came across a James Baldwin quote that I think for the most part sums up how I feel professionally about my work, how I feel personally about my work, and what I think is necessary in order for, I think, this society to achieve whatever goal it is for betterment. And the quote comes from a letter that James Baldwin wrote to Angela Davis when she was incarcerated. And he was having a conversation with her via letter about what we now know as intersectionality. And basically the quote is, if we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable the corridor to the gas chamber, for if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us at night. And, just kind of recognizing that nothing happens in a vacuum. You can't be concerned about one group of people or one issue because it directly impacts you, but then not pay attention to the people or the issues that you think don't directly impact you, because ultimately everything directly impacts everybody, and it's all connected, it's all related.
Yeah, I think to agree and then to add to that is, as much as I'm kind of a dreamer and a creative thinker and believe that it's art and creativity that's going to pave the way, we can't create it unless we're capable of imagining it. I also simultaneously am a student of Afro-pessimism, which is to say that within the world as we know it, nothing can actually be better. It can change shape, it can improve in certain ways within the system, but there won't be a solid moment where it's white supremacy is gone, Black lives are totally liberated and free, in any number of ways, So I kind of go back and forth between working very diligently against my own Scorpio rising to imagine a world that has all of these things in it that we fight for, and also am constantly aware of how improbable that is without some kind of miracle happening, which the fact that we have come as far as we have is a miracle in a human. It's human because we did it. It's not magical, but it is in ways a miracle in and of itself. So it's kind of going back and forth between taking the deep breaths, imagining the future, using art and creativity and writing to imagine the future, and also having those moments between breaths that are like, we can never settle, even for a moment, to just change things within the current constructs because it's impossible. So how to actually break free of those, all of those constructs as we know it. So it's a little bit of a back and forth, and maybe that's a little esoteric. I know.
Right, and I'm the opposite. Like I operate in, I guess, Afro-pessimism constantly. I always say, like, there's the world that we currently live in, and then there's the world that we're, striving to create. And I operate in the world that we currently live in. So I'm not really a dreamer in that regard. We often joke and say, like, let's say that, like, we had a friend and, somebody beat that friend up. Brydie is the one that's going to be like, okay, well, like, how did that make you feel? How are you feeling about that? Like, they're going to be there to, like, talk about it and process it. Meanwhile, I'm going to be like, who hit you? Point them out right now. And so I think, for me, when I think about, how things in this world can change, I think about how really nothing in the world has ever changed without a couple of things. One, violence. Like, this is a country that is rooted in violence. This is a world that is rooted in violence. And the other countries in this world that practice violence that generally didn't, like, it wasn't endemic in their society, came about because of, colonialism and whiteness. And, that's kind of how they operate now. And so it's kind of like the language that, like, this country speaks. It's the language that this world speaks. And so, how can we change it? And I think this is, like, the argument between, like, Malcolm X and King, right? Like, how do we change it speaking a different language? And so whereas Brydie, operates through, art and, thoughts and processing, I personally prefer to operate in training, because it's the world that we live in. And, being able to, not, like, in any way, like, advocating, for violence or anything, but operating and, like, being prepared and understanding the language that is so commonly spoken in this country and in this world.
I think you're, like, pointing to our cardinal modes of being too. Like, you're definitely a thinker and processor as well, and I'm definitely gonna find that person that hurt our friends, but my gut reaction made to make sure that they're well wrapped up in protection first, or you might run out the door. So, and it takes both, it takes both of those modes of being to get any kind of healing actually made, because it's not enough to feel good, and that's kind of what, like, Afro-pessimism isn't necessarily just this negative outlook. It's more just constantly understanding as a framework how continued colonialism, continued effects of mass enslavement, of chattel slavery, how the continued effects of all of these systems impact us right now and how they continue to impact us. And it asks the question, is it possible to overcome racism? Which is not actually a Black question, right? It's a white question. So Afro-pessimism is essentially saying there's actually very little that we can do. We can change our situations, and we have drastically. We freed ourselves from enslavement. We, did the actions leading to Black, queer, the liberations that we have, as limited as they may be. We did those things. However, those were all in the system. Is there a solution to racism? And that's a question for white people to work on and work through, because it's essentially saying if it's only us, then there is no solution because we are not doing it, right?
And that's like the second way in which change comes about, which is like white people make it. Also throughout history, if we look at the change that's happened, whether it's like the Emancipation Proclamation or the Civil Rights Act, not to discount what Black folks did as actions, because like that was important. Like being the bee in the bonnet of the system is definitely helpful. But those things ultimately happened because some white person was like, fine. Like it's always been like as a concession. So it's we don't really write the policies. We're more in the rooms when policies are written, but ultimately it comes as a concession of some white person or some white people in positions of power to be like, okay, we're gonna change this, even if their behavior doesn't change necessarily, like the policy might change.
Well, and I really appreciate that the framing that you all are sharing is not the way that you all have described it is not one that I've heard specifically enunciated in that way before. So I appreciate hearing that, and it makes me think about, I can't remember if it was Freakonomics, there was a podcast on NPR, and it was talking about, and this was based on some economic and different projections, but if you think about like the LGBTQ plus community and stigma related to them, they were projecting that like within 20 years, that would kind of be neutralized. And then when they ran the model in terms of the Black community, it was like 130, 150 years. And then they even did one more layer, which was around ageism, and that was that was even a little bit more, but kind of what you all are talking about is the change in terms of, specifically when we think about racism and racial justice, is going to be beyond any of our lifetime before it is, like so far in the future. And so how do you hold in harmony what you can do right now, what will be within what you will live to be able to see, and then how much, knowing, harboring, hopefully that in the future it's going to get there. And so that's kind of what I'm hearing of those two contexts trying to live or being grappled with at the same time.
Right, and those are just identity silos. So what does that mean for Black trans women, for example, 3 of which were murdered this week, one of which was a 17-year-old child, So as far as we push, the political subject of Black queer folks is essentially nil, because instead of being understood as lives that matter or political subjects, they're understood as kind of just a bargaining chip for other movements, whether it's feminism or LGBT rights, or on the flip side with conservatives, whether it's talking about the economy or homelessness or any number of things where Black life is kind of lodged as a tool of analysis and not as, oh, these are lives that matter in felt ways. So even when used as a tool for analysis from progressives who then try to make lives better through administrative sort of ways or law, legislative, we see actually greater support for white, cis, gay, and lesbian sort of heteronormative relationships, and more damage to Black, queer, and trans, especially youth and the elderly, those two groups. So I guess it goes back again to like, how do we just do work totally outside of these systems? And maybe that's why when you ask us, our responses are like, well, we grow vegetables and we shoot guns, because we learned that changing laws doesn't work, but feeding and protecting people does. That's something that the Black Panthers knew. That's something that Black Lives Matter, the Black queer women who started Black Lives Matter know. That it's actually feeding and protecting one another, and by one another, the one another that Zion invokes, indigenous people, Latinx people, all of us, feeding and protecting, clothing and loving.
Yeah, and you brought up, both of you have brought up in different ways the intersectionality piece, and one of the conversations, one of the topics that we've been talking about each week is a focus on covering, so the downplaying or hiding of different facets of ourselves while we're at work or in life, and the ramifications that can have. And then also thinking about the flip side of, where do we have space or the ability to kind of uncover and change some of those dynamics, especially if we can do that within the places where we work or within more systems level places. So I'd love to shift our conversation just slightly to hear if you all have examples of instances of covering and how. Let's start with there. I won't ask you a bunch of questions all rolled into one. We'll just start with that and kind of take it from there.
Yeah, like when we looked at that question, and like my response is like, even though we call it code switching, and even though I do speak that language fluently, I rarely, if ever, use it. I don't know, like I grew up going to predominantly white schools for grade school. So definitely, I think that's definitely where I learned, like how to speak that different language, or how to, kind of be able to present myself in a safer, less threatening way, however that looks for an elementary student. But then, went to I went to an HBCU, a historically Black college. And, that was the first time that I ever had, like a Black male teacher. Like I was like 27 when I went to undergrad. So definitely, like being in that environment and not, really having to code switch was definitely great. And then for grad school, went back to a predominantly white institution. And again, in public health. So I have like an MPH in community and behavioral health. And, one of the things that I always say about, public health as the field that I work in, is that, I don't know, like, I mean, as with everything in academia, like it's rooted in whiteness and like loves mediocre white women. And so I had like a lot of like mediocre white female teachers that literally would like they're in front of the class and they're only speaking what the literature says, kind of like going back to, people of color and like underrepresented people being utilized as like a tool for analysis. We have like this collective literature that's rooted in whiteness and white supremacy. And so like a teacher would be in front of me and, say, like I am just like astounded at how, single Black mothers are able to do what they do. And like she specifically does research on like Black mothers. And I'm like thinking, well, that was my mom. And I'm like the only person of color in the room. I'm the only like person like fat of center in the room. And, just kind of like seeing these things like operate as normal. And so at that moment I was like, yeah, like, no, like I don't care about, code switching to like make other people, feel comfortable. And I'm incredibly privileged in the job that I have right now, in that, like I'm not required to do that. Like I got that job because of a situation where like I not only refused to code switch, but like called, people out on their stuff. Mm-hmm. And, like super privileged that I have a boss that, regularly says, say what you need to say and I'll take the call. And, she's a older Black, pediatrician epidemiologist from Metcalfe County. You know, so, but then like I was talking to my coworker the other day and it's like, yeah, like that's cool and everything. But like, in addition to her taking the call for whatever we say, you know, she's also just like taking a whole bunch of other stuff because like she's that older black woman, pediatrician, epidemiologist from Metcalfe County that works in diversity and inclusion and is constantly like, you know, pressuring and pushing, you know, white supremacy within like an academic structure. So you can imagine that she's not incredibly popular. You know, so like just kind of like this, like the stress that puts on her. So I think it's like when you're in these moments where like you choose not to code switch, like 9 times out of 10, like the consequences of that, you know, like who do the consequences fall on, basically, especially like in a work structure. It's different than like when I'm out and about, like that's on me. But like, you know, in a work structure, especially in a position where you're trying to, you know, kind of like change things by operating within the system that is popular and, you know, whatever field it is that you're working in, like that those consequences fall on somebody. And usually that person is another underrepresented person.
Yeah.
Not to be too much of a millennial, but I'm just going to drink out of this mason jar really quick.
Hydration's important.
It really is. It really is. Yeah, I'm fascinated by this term of covering because I have not come across it as a theory or word to describe this. We always call it code switching. But covering is really interesting because it seems to apply some sort of protective layer. So again, we go back to, you know, this isn't our work. So in a way, it's like, I don't know, I would think if you were to tell me just the word covering and didn't tell me what it meant at all, I would think, oh, some sort of self-preservation, you know, in an Audre Lorde, in a Lordian sense, some sort of self-preservation. But then to hear it in the context of how we're talking about it, it just seems like another heavy burden to carry. And I think I'm sure that it looks like different things for me, but also for people in general. You know, there's been moments, I'm sure, where both of us have been silent about one thing or another. Probably not something ongoing, but one moment of something, just because it's like, we can't be on all the time. It's way too exhausting. And it's also not our job. You know, pay me $60 for every, you know, 10 minutes or so, and we can have a little bit of back and forth. But if I'm just in whatever kind of position, just trying to get work done, then no, I don't. That's not part of my list of responsibilities, you know. And this extends far and wide. I mean, it applies to even in these spaces that maybe where it's all black folks, black studies. Well, there's still patriarchy. Well, there's still homophobia. There's still transphobia. There's still sexism. There's still colorism, you know, which is just an example, something I benefit from. But, you know, just as an example, there's so many layers that if it was really covering, it would be like an onion. You know, like maybe I take this layer off and decide, you know, to be all the way black at work or school, but I don't decide that I have the mental or even physical capability of taking off a queer cover layer. Mm-hmm. Because we have to keep in mind it's not like our decision, typically. It's an issue of safety. People lose their jobs, people lose their lives, you know, so I don't know exactly how to answer this question because, of course, I've put on multiple layers of covering depending on what situation I may be in. I don't walk into, as a person who researches Black theology, I don't walk into Black church spaces queer first. You know, I walk in black first and trick them, get them to fall in love with me, and then I'm like, ha ha,
Got
I'm
you.
super gay, and now you're gay, and we're all gay because I was breathing up in here. You know, like, you know, it's a little bit of negotiation. I'm outspoken about a lot of things. But if I'm talking to an older black man, which I recently had a conversation with an older black man about the black power, I may not go in full throttle around, you know, the benefits of black power as an ideology. I may start by explaining, you know, by having inviting him into a dialogue with me in a way where I may not spend the time if just a random white coworker, bartender, or Susan Sally Who on the street was like, F black power, that's the same as white power. I may say, you know, okay, very well, goodbye. You know, good for you, well done. So it's just, I think in a way it's a protective layer, but also in another way it's not a choice. Sometimes it comes down to a real issue of safety and livelihood. So in a perfect world, we would not have the need for any kind of covering, unless so desired, because there's also a choice around privacy, you know, and self-preservation in those kinds of ways. I don't necessarily want to be all the time just a black, queer, outspoken Jew in every situation. You know, sometimes I just want to buy my little zucchini and get out of the grocery store or finish my little work project.
Yeah, I mean, like it definitely. Yeah, I feel like it definitely isn't like a choice so much, and it kind of makes me think of like when people, you know, are just like, oh, well, like why are you like interested in, you know, trans masculine reproductive health? Well, it's not an interest, you know. Like I feel like the things that we do, whether it's like research or what we major in, you know, for school, like our like goals and objectives of life generally aren't rooted in something that's fun or something that's interesting. It's a necessity. And you know, I think back to like when I was in undergrad, you know, again at an HBCU, and I don't think I really like feared being like queer at that HBCU. We were very lucky. You know, North Carolina Central University was the first of the 11 HBCUs in North Carolina to have an LGBTQ center, and the second one in the country. You know, so definitely a different atmosphere. But you know, being in public health where there were very few male-identified folks, being in a situation where, you know, I had to be like, okay, do I want to be the person that like people, you know, perceive as being like, you know, a cis man that like pushes and questions things that generally a lot of like other cis black men don't? Or do I want to like be queer and then kind of like have whatever I say, you know, kind of like boil down to like, oh, well, there's Xian just being like that angry black queer again. And, you know, like I opted for the former. And I feel like I often do that a lot. And I think I don't know, I think it's like kind of interesting and like an interesting exercise, you know, like in gender, because there's like a lot of things that I do that like I guess people would consider like gender non-conforming or not like typical. And so like that, I think has been like very interesting and like kind of like the same as Brydie says, like, you know, getting, you know, someone to be like, oh man, like you're the coolest thing or like the coolest person. And then as time goes on, they're like, oh snap, I didn't know. And it's just like, yeah, well, like none of that matters, right? Like none of that ultimately matters.
And I think to expand on that, we're not saying, and I know you're not taking this way, Josh, but for anyone listening, we're not saying that we're ever leaving any part of ourselves behind or even going back into the closet, so to speak. I'm 100% all of me all of the time. And it's also not to say that I may behave in certain ways always out of fear. I think especially for Black women, people who have been conditioned and raised as women and Black femmes, we use our awareness of how society works because Black women know how society works more than anyone. because we see all of the layers and how they impact us. So we use that knowledge in social situations and leverage it for creating change, for keeping ourselves and our those we love in our communities safe, for getting what we need, for stealing power right from underneath people, and then coming back with that, aha, we've been hip to this all along, and now this is ours. So it's not always just, oh, I'm not going to share this with whoever, I'm going to remain covered because of X, Y, and Z, shame or unsafety or this and that. Sometimes it is just a political tool to survive the society that we actually live in. It's part of our agency as full human beings to say, in this space, this is who I am because I'm amongst my own people. And here amongst my own people, I'm all of these things, and I don't have to ever say it. It's not it being done intentionally. It's just we are understanding one another because we have the same cultural signifiers and same language and all of these things. But over here, when I am not amongst my own people, I'm going to leverage my awareness of how society works in particular ways for any number of gains or protections or even manipulations.
And also just recognizing that, yeah, it's strategic, like you said, and also that like folks like Brydie and I, like have the privilege to do that. I think that's something that, like, and growing up and like being a community organizer, like we definitely noticed those things, like when we talked about like, like the constitutional amendments, right, on marriage. That was something that we learned, from Harvey Milk days, where it's like it's about these one-on-one interactions that ultimately change people, right? So that's why he was just like, yeah, everybody come out, right? Like come out to people one-on-one so that they can see like, who they've been interacting with the whole time. And like, even when I did the work, like back in 2004 on the marriage amendment, like, yeah, like that does work. And for whatever reason, like underrepresented people always have the onus of like presenting themselves or like, having to do the work to make themselves seem human. So that people can like be like, oh yeah, your life does matter. Like you are a human being. And, I think that like the small things that folks like me and Brydie are privileged enough to do are kind of like rooted in like that, Harvey Milk ideology where we're just like doing these things and having these interactions because like, yeah, other people can't. Like other people do have to fear for their safety. Other people do have to fear, for their jobs and for their families. And we don't.
This is something we see time and time again in any kind of in every hierarchy, which every identity in that's been westernized is based on hierarchy. And so that's why you see white people going to black people and saying, "Well, just show me your pain, prove that I'm hurting you," or why didn't you say something if it was so bad? And you see black men saying to queer folks, or just, cishet people of multiple races saying to the queer people of their own, why didn't you just do something? Why didn't you stand up? How am I hurting you? Prove it. You see it's men to women, cis folks to trans folks. The list goes on to able-bodied people to disabled people. From the young to the old. Why didn't you just tell me that you were lonely, that you were being injured in these ways? There's always this like the forced evidence of proof that the bully is hurting the victim in some kind of way, even though they know exactly and could explain it better if they only did so, because they know exactly what they're doing. Yeah, I mean, we went off a little bit, so.
No, I think the way that you all have, I think your so much of what you said I have resonated with, and it helps to add like the description of the onion and the layers, I think is a really good image to think about in terms of the different facets that we're bringing to the table. And Brydie, you asked about kind of the genesis of or one of the uses of the covering term, and Deloitte created a report called Uncovering Talent. And so they looked at people's affiliation or various areas, whether it's physical appearance, groups they affiliate with, et cetera. And they looked at covering and age, all these different facets. And they looked at it from, straight white men, Black women, LGBTQ plus, kind of cross-cutting all of those. And so one of the things that we've been trying to engage people in this conversation, as we're trying to help people understand how people show up and where those layers may or may not be present, and the implications of not feeling like some of your layers are welcome, because not everybody, and we can generalize about which groups that is, straight, white, very privileged people at the top of that list, but there are different people who don't even recognize the layers that can't be brought to the table and what that impact is. And so part of this discussion is really just helping to educate people, but also, like you said, there is strategy. And so, how are you being cognizant of that and what you're bringing to the table? And I loved that you talked about, sometimes you step into the room leading with a layer, and that's the layer people are falling in love with, and you're able to slowly bring other facets in. And I know that that's something in my own way that I've experienced. So the way that you all collectively answered that made it a very robust, even more robust way of thinking about it. So I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
So we're in our last minute or two. So, Louisville and our nation in general is dealing with so much in terms of racial injustice and how much work our community needs to do. We've seen community members who haven't spoken up before stepping up in new ways. But how are you? I would just love to kind of check in with you all. How has that been? How are you all doing? And as a couple, as individuals, as community members, as we're thinking about where Louisville is going, I've heard you all have described some of how you think about, the impact and the work in the near term, but just where you are mentally, as we or other things you'd like to share as we wrap up our conversation today.
Well, something that's on my mind throughout this conversation, and to maybe continue a little bit with this idea of covering, we Black folks in the U.S. have a very rich material culture and naming culture, renaming culture, desire for sustainability, for the continuation of traditions, whether these things are really cognizant or not. These are things that we brought over, from the continent, these traditions. So I think it's important to pay attention to the change in materiality, the way that we are going and occupying literal spaces and changing their names. In Justice Park, this is Brianna's Bridge. I can barely talk about it without crying, because these are things that are so deeply powerful. A change in what people are literally wearing. You'll start to see almost this uniform appear of all different kinds. And there's a range. This is not to say there's a monolith, but the actual darning of sort of a way to present ourselves, a way of speaking. You'll hear people talk more and more about moral centers and all of these things where there's a real change occurring just through the physical act, the subversive act of taking over predominantly white spaces that have done a lot of harm to us, and going there and playing the piano and dancing and renaming it and feeding one another and keeping one another hydrated through a ministry of water and all of these things that get overlooked that are perhaps some of the most powerful things that are happening right now. And it's those kinds of things, like we talked about before, that are going to really be ongoing. People are going to remember those kinds of moments, you know. They're not easily forgotten, seeing Brianna over the water, you know, and water itself is so significant in lots of African diasporic cultures. So all of these number of things give me a lot of a sense of hope about not just Louisville, but Louisville as an example of something happening much, much, much broader than here. And you're probably going to give a much more pragmatic answer than this. a clear example of maybe what I'm talking about here, of something totally different. But to me, it's paying attention to the ways in which we have always operated. It's remembering that this is just one moment on a long arc of fighting for the liberation of Black lives, which includes all Black lives, you know. It's remembering that this is just one moment on an arc that turns toward justice, even if that's not something we ever get to. That's where it's headed. Yeah. Not in our lifetimes. But it's remembering both the details of the name changing of the water, of what we carry as a diasporic people, and the bigger picture. And the bigger picture that we are always fighting for liberation. This is just one small moment. So if this dies down, not to say, oh, well, that was a failure. No, that was a moment. Yes. In a hundreds of years tradition of fighting for our own lives and being highly successful in that fight for our own lives.
Yeah, like I think like Brydie says, like I do kind of, I think come at it from a little bit of a different place. You know, like we'll despite the love-hate relationship that I've had with it for quite some time, is my home. I was born and raised here. So when I look at what's happening, you know, I'm simultaneously like, okay, well, this isn't new. You know, Louisville Metro Police Department or Louisville Police Department over the span of time, you know, turned into Metro, you know, have a history in harming unarmed Black people. You know, they I mean, it just is. And there's also a history of like zero accountability, you know, coming along with that. I think that that's, you know, true for many other cities and states where, you know, uprisings are happening. I think on the other hand, it's also really difficult because, you know, growing up, you know, kind of like being like a little an activist, you know, or an organizer, you know, like you know, I would never ever like go the opposite direction. It was always, all right, like anti-police brutality rally, like there. Oh, there's a Klan rally going on in Jefferson Square Park, there. These days a little different, you know, because it's COVID. You know, like I'm asthmatic, like I can't get sick. And these are also like things that I never thought about, like, you know, when I was younger. Granted, like COVID didn't exist, but I never thought about like, oh, I could be harmed.
Like if we die, we die.
Right, like in any way whatsoever. But it's like, no, like I definitely cannot, you know, get sick. And, you know, also thinking, you know, I was talking to some friends about this, you know, that we all grew up together, and I was like, yeah, like when I look at like what each of us is doing now, like it's all like rooted in like the same energy and like motivation from when we were younger, but like it just kind of looks different. And you know, the other thing is like I can't catch a case, like I can't get into legal trouble. Like I'm trying to be a nurse practitioner, I can't get into legal trouble. You know, and just kind of like the ways in which, like the ways that we like are trying to like show up in a space for change kind of like affects what you're able to do. So it's been, I've often said like they're making it harder and harder every day to stay home. We do things like, we'll take food or ice or, donate money or whatever, but every day it's harder and harder to stay home.
Right. We try to mitigate the harm that may come to us, our literal bodies. And then we also keep in mind that we could be killed at this very moment. Someone could storm into this room while we're on tape because one of us, probably Xian, fit the description. And because I'm not, my proximity to whiteness is not even adjacent, maybe 2 blocks over, I'm not going to be a good enough alibi, right? My words won't mean anything. So we've said this to one another, like, yes, there's a pandemic, but there's 2 pandemics. There's 2 concurrent pandemics. So when the choice is death or death, what do? You have to at least try to fight. I think that's what's going through the minds of those who are out on the streets. They know that they're putting themselves in danger, and they know that they're already in danger. And I know that there's also those of us who are involved in organizations and universities and are writing and are doing interviews and this kind of thing like we are now, who are trying to funnel some of that work into dialogue, whether it be written or conversational. And that too is important. But there's always that feeling from our youth when we were both street activists, the siren sign of getting out there. And I would love nothing more than to, never mind, there's plenty of things going on in my mind that I would love nothing more than to do. But right now, this looks like this. Yeah. This looks like this in this moment.
The other thing too that what's going on is made me think of, and I've written about a couple of times for our office newsletters, is I think really hard before saying this, because I was like, hey, if I'm thinking about history, I don't, at least in my 37 years of life, I don't think that there's been a time since what was experienced in the 50s and 60s that we've not, I don't think we've experienced this level. Things have always been bad. There's a lot of the things that are happening right now have always happened, but just to have that perfect storm of things where you've got belligerent whiteness and white supremacy in the House and Senate and in the White House, combined with state sanctioned murders, combined with militia individuals who are using the same civil rights era scare tactics, like burning down churches, or being plants in a peaceful protest, and ramping up the violence. I feel like the next thing we just need is fire hoses and dogs. I feel like we have not really been at this place.
Yeah, and I would say to anyone who, for whatever bizarre reason, could be watching this and are a participator or proponent in those civil rights era kinds of actions, know that we are not using the same civil rights era actions that they did, as good as they were.
Right.
We are using them and have learned from them and are using many, many other kinds of actions. So this is a very, very different time. And I think between gardening and MMA and any number of tactics, they're all being used. Everything is coming. Invocation of the spirits, literally everything is coming. Black witches are building, gardens against this. So be very, very careful, because you're about to lose your job, your life. Watch this.
I mean, that's true, right? Because I feel like those things haven't changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, we're doing them and also.
Right, but the world around them has changed, which I think is another reason that things are so dangerous right now. Because what happens when you don't have control? What happens when a person doesn't have control over their locus, right? What happens when people feel ultimately helpless, especially white folks? What happens? Things get crazy. So this is definitely, I think, a case of like it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
Um, I I definitely think that I hate even like saying this out loud, but I do think that like this is like the things that are happening as far as like what some people in positions of power or some people with like social capital are doing is different. Like the responses are different, um, which is like kind of, yeah, it's kind of weird.
And then too, I mean, thank you for giving us this 20 minute or two. The thing too is everything is siphoned through the world as it is. So even when we get letters from banks and North Face that are like Black Lives Matter, it's like, okay, neoliberalism, you really stretched to the furthest of your capacities. What does that mean for my life? In reality. So I guess the message from both of us is like, there is hope and there is no hope, and do what you will with that. Continue to fight somewhere in between, a little bit Buddhist. Like you may never get to this perfect place of serenity and peace, but you must always fight toward it. That's our job, for everyone. So I guess for me, the takeaway is, yeah, yeah.
I think that's a great encapsulation of what you all have described in terms of the different forces at play and the role that individually we have within how to navigate and move them forward in different ways. So we thank you both for making time today. I really appreciate it. Theo and I are forever grateful to have you all as friends and family in this journey, and we have quite an interesting road ahead for all of us.
We do.
But thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you all soon.
All right, thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to our last Uncovering Connection and Inclusion video podcast for the season. You can watch past conversations, rewatch this one at ideasxlab.com/uncovering, and we will talk to you soon.